Naomi Bright stood frozen in the west corridor of Ravenswood Estate, one hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall, the other clutching a folded stack of linens like they were the only thing keeping her upright. Her breath came in shallow pulls. Somewhere behind her, through a gap in a half-closed door, she had just watched a man she trusted place something small and deliberate behind a bank of security monitors. It was not a coincidence. It was not routine maintenance. It was a device built for one purpose: to strip away Adrian Castellan's eyes and ears at the exact moment he needed them most. She should have felt only fear. Fear was the correct response for a maid who had stumbled onto something she wasn't meant to see. But underneath the fear, something colder and more familiar moved through her chest, the same feeling she got every time a piece on a chessboard shifted without her permission. Because Naomi Bright was not just a maid. For 3 years, under a different name, in rooms no one at Ravenswood would ever be allowed to enter, she had built and quietly ruled something far larger than this house. They called it the Hollow Circle, a network so careful, so deliberately invisible, that most of the city's criminal factions didn't know it existed. It didn't fight wars. It prevented them. It moved money, moved secrets, moved threats out of the way before they became bloodshed, and it did all of this without a single face attached to its name. Adrian Castellan, the man whose shirts she pressed and whose coffee she poured every morning, was the last major player in the city who didn't answer to her network, and the one man whose death, right now, at this exact fragile moment, would collapse everything she had spent 3 years building. She had taken this job 8 months ago as an experiment, a way to watch him up close, to understand the one piece of the board she couldn't read from a distance. She had never expected to fall into the strange rhythm of his household, to memorize the sound of his footsteps, to know which of his silences meant thinking and which meant danger. She had certainly never expected to be standing in a hallway holding her breath, watching a traitor plant a bomb disguised as a security override, knowing that if she didn't do something in the next few minutes, the empire above hers and the empire beneath her disguise would both come apart at the seams. Down the hall, a door opened. Heavy, unhurried footsteps began their walk toward the office. Naomi's fingers tightened around the linens until her knuckles went white. She had built her entire existence around never being seen. And now, the only way to save the one man capable of ending her network without ever knowing her name was to walk directly into the light and let him see her. For the first time in 3 years, Naomi Bright understood that being invisible was no longer a shield. It was about to become a countdown. She forced herself to move, one careful step at a time, the linens still clutched against her chest like a shield made of nothing. The corridor stretched ahead of her, lined with portraits of Castellans long dead, men whose painted eyes seemed to track her passage with the same suspicion she imagined would fill Adrian's if he ever learned what she truly was. She had walked this hallway 100 times without a single thought in her head beyond the next task, the next room, the next hour of careful, practiced nothing. Now every footstep felt like a decision she couldn't take back. Behind her, in the office she had just watched Julian Pierce leave, something small and patient waited in the dark, counting down toward a moment neither Adrian nor his security team had any reason to suspect was coming. She thought of the years she had spent building the Hollow Circle exactly so that moments like this one would never happen, so that men like Julian would never find room to maneuver, so that cities would never wake up to headlines about empires collapsing overnight into open war. She had failed to see this coming from 3 miles away, hidden behind screens and encrypted channels. She had only seen it because she had been foolish enough, or perhaps honest enough, to get close. The footsteps down the hall grew louder. Naomi's pulse climbed with them, and somewhere beneath the fear, that same cold, familiar clarity settled over her shoulders like a second uniform, the one she wore when the stakes stopped being personal and started being everything. Ravenswood Estate ran on rules nobody wrote down, but everyone obeyed. Staff did not speak unless spoken to. Staff did not linger in rooms where business was discussed. Staff did not, under any circumstance, appear to notice anything. Naomi had learned these rules faster than anyone in the house's history, mostly because she had written similar rules herself for a very different kind of organization. Her mornings began at 5. She polished the brass fixtures in the east wing until they held the ceiling lights like small suns. She replaced the fresh flowers in the entry hall, always white, always sourced fresh, an eccentric standing order from Adrian Castellan that none of the staff questioned, and Naomi privately found strangely tender for a man, built entirely out of hard edges. She had come to Ravenswood under a manufactured resume, a manufactured accent, a manufactured woman named Naomi Bright, who had worked in 3 other wealthy households and left each one quietly, without complaint or incident. It was, like everything the Hollow Circle produced, flawless. What she had not planned for was how easy it would become to disappear into the role. The other staff barely looked at her. Vincent Ossa, the head of household security, a broad-shouldered man with suspicious eyes and a habit of standing too close to doorways, had interviewed her personally in her second week, asking sharp questions about her background that she answered with practiced calm. He hadn't trusted her fully then. She doubted he trusted anyone fully, but he had let her stay, and eventually his eyes stopped tracking her the way they once had. That was the point. That was always the point. She learned the house the way she learned everything, patiently, methodically, cataloging details that seemed insignificant until they weren't. She learned which guards rotated shifts at which hours. She learned that Adrian took his coffee black, no exceptions, and that he read 3 newspapers before 9 and trusted none of them. She learned that he spoke to almost no one directly except a tight circle of 4 men, and that among those 4, Julian Pierce stood closest. Julian had a warm laugh and an easy manner that made him popular with the household staff. He remembered names. He remembered birthdays. He was, by every visible measure, the most human person in Adrian Castellan's inner circle. Naomi had disliked him from the first week. In the quiet, wordless way, she distrusted anyone who worked that hard to be liked. There had been one evening, early in her assignment, when Julian had lingered near the kitchen while she prepared the evening trays, making easy conversation about nothing in particular. The weather, the flowers, a joke about how the head chef guarded the pantry like a vault. Naomi had smiled at the right moments and offered nothing of substance in return, the same practiced deflection she had used 100 times before on men who mistook charm for entitlement to information. Julian had eventually wandered off, apparently satisfied, but Naomi had noticed something in the set of his shoulders as he left, a restlessness that didn't match the relaxed persona he wore so easily for everyone else. She had filed it away. She filed everything away. It was, she often thought, the one true continuity between the woman who dusted mahogany shelves and the woman who once sat in darkened rooms negotiating ceasefires between men who would have killed each other on sight. Both versions of her survived by noticing what other people overlooked. Adrian himself remained the largest gap in her otherwise meticulous understanding of Ravenswood. He was disciplined in ways that made him difficult to read even from close range. He didn't drink to excess, didn't indulge in the kind of visible vices that gave lesser men away, didn't surround himself with the noise and spectacle so many of his rivals used to broadcast their power. He ruled through restraint, and restraint, Naomi had come to understand over 8 careful months, was the hardest thing in the world to counterfeit convincingly. It was also, she suspected privately, the reason she had started paying more attention to him than any assignment strictly required. She kept her suspicion to herself, the same way she kept everything to herself. Her real work happened after midnight, in a locked room above a laundromat 3 miles from the estate, where a burner terminal connected her to Camille Dury, her second-in-command, and to the slow, careful machinery of the Hollow Circle. Camille didn't know exactly where Naomi disappeared for 8 months. She knew only that her leader had gone quiet on a project called Ravenswood, and that quiet, from Naomi, usually meant something important was close to breaking. Naomi told herself over and over that this assignment was reconnaissance, nothing more. She was here to understand Adrian Castellan, not to feel anything about him. But there were mornings, rare, unguarded mornings, when she caught him staring out at the gardens with an expression that looked almost lonely, and she felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with strategy. She buried it. She always buried it. Feeling things about the men she watched was not part of the plan. What she hadn't planned for, what no version of her careful preparation had accounted for, was the morning Julian Pierce would walk into the private library carrying something that didn't belong there, and that Naomi, dusting a shelf 3 feet away, would be the only person in the house who saw him do it. There had been small warning signs before that, in hindsight, that Naomi had noted and filed away without fully understanding their weight. Julian arriving early on days he usually arrived late. Julian taking calls in the garden instead of his office, pacing the gravel paths with his phone pressed too tightly to his ear. Julian's easy laugh growing thinner over the past month, stretched at the edges like fabric worn down from too much use. She had noticed these things the way she noticed everything, filed, catalogued, set aside for later analysis, because that was the discipline the Hollow Circle had drilled into her long before she ever set foot in Ravenswood. Nothing was insignificant. Everything eventually mattered. She had not expected it to matter this fast, or this close to home. On the night before it happened, she had lain awake in her small staff quarters at the edge of the estate, listening to the wind move through the gardens outside her window, and had allowed herself just once to wonder what would happen if Adrian Castellan ever discovered who she really was. Would he see the woman who had quietly kept his empire's most dangerous rivals in check for 3 years, or would he only see the stranger who had lied to his face for 8 months, pouring his coffee with hands that had once signed off on decisions that reshaped entire criminal territories? She had told herself the question didn't matter, because he would never find out. She had been wrong about a great many things in her life. She was about to discover she had been wrong about that one, too. Adrian Castellan did not wake up. He resumed. At 5:40 each morning, before the household staff finished their first pot of coffee, he was already in the private gym off the east wing, gloves laced, moving through combinations with the flat, economical violence of a man who had learned young that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. He didn't grunt. He didn't strain. He simply worked methodically until sweat soaked through his shirt and his knuckles ached in a way that felt like clarity. Power, to Adrian, had never been about noise. His father had taught him that lesson in the worst possible way, dying loud, dying visible, dying in a way that left the family exposed to every rival who had been waiting for weakness. Adrian had buried that man at 19 and rebuilt what was left of the family's holdings into something colder, quieter, and far harder to kill. The Castellan Syndicate did not announce itself. It didn't need to. Everyone in the city already knew what it was capable of, and that knowledge did more work than any show of force ever could. By 6:30, he was showered and dressed, standing before the mirror in his private suite while he fixed his cufflinks with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. He trusted very few people. Julian Pierce, mostly, because Julian had been with him for 6 years and had never once given him reason to doubt. Vincent Ossa, because Vincent's paranoia was useful and mostly aimed outward. Beyond that, trust was a resource Adrian spent as sparingly as he spent anything. He did not think about the household staff. They existed at the edge of his awareness the way furniture existed, necessary, unremarkable, invisible. He knew distantly that a woman named Naomi had been hired 8 months ago and kept the house running with unusual precision. He had exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences with her in that time. He would not have been able to describe her face from memory. His relationship with the syndicate itself was similarly guarded. Beneath him sat a structure of lieutenants and captains who ran the day-to-day operations across 3 districts, each of them reporting upward through channels designed to keep any single person from ever holding the full picture. Julian occupied the rare position of seeing more of that picture than anyone besides Adrian himself, a privilege earned through 6 years of unwavering, demonstrated loyalty, the kind Adrian had learned, the hard way, not to extend easily. He thought briefly of his father's final months, of the slow accumulation of small betrayals that had preceded the loud public death that ended his reign. His father had trusted too widely, and too late recognized which of those trusts had rotted from the inside. Adrian had spent 2 decades building the opposite reputation, a man who trusted almost no one, and who consequently could not be undone the same way. He believed, walking toward his office that morning, that this discipline made him untouchable. He did not yet understand that untouchable men were often the easiest to blindside, precisely because they had stopped looking in the one direction they considered beneath their notice. This was, he would later understand, the most dangerous blind spot he had ever allowed himself. That morning, like every morning, he walked the length of the upstairs hallway toward his private office, a room he trusted above every other room in the house, soundproofed, monitored, swept for surveillance twice a week by a man Julian had personally vetted. It was, in Adrian's mind, the safest square foot of real estate in the entire city. He had no reason to believe otherwise. He passed the library on his way, nodding once at the woman dusting the mahogany shelves without truly seeing her, his mind already 3 steps ahead, running through the numbers for the morning's meeting with a shipping contact who had been slow to pay. He didn't notice the way her hand froze mid-motion. He didn't notice the sudden stillness in her shoulders. He was already at the office door, his fingers closing around the brass handle, entirely unaware that the safest room in his empire had just become the most dangerous. Adrian Castellan ruled through silence, through control, through the absolute certainty that nothing moved in his world without his knowledge. That certainty had cost him things over the years, friendships he never allowed to form. A marriage that had ended quietly, years ago, when his wife had finally admitted she couldn't live inside a house that felt more like a fortress than a home. He didn't regret the choices that had built his empire, but there were nights, rare and unwelcome, when the size of the silence around him felt less like protection and more like a sentence he had passed on himself. He didn't dwell on those nights. Dwelling was a weakness, and weakness, in his world, got you buried before your 40th birthday. He reached the office door and paused, his hand resting against the wood for a moment before he pushed it open, the same brief pause he allowed himself every morning, a habit so old he no longer remembered when it had started. Some instinct, buried deep beneath decades of discipline, seemed to hesitate today in a way he couldn't name. He dismissed it. Instinct without evidence was just fear wearing a more respectable name, and Adrian Castellan had no patience for fear. In less than a minute, that certainty was going to be tested by the one person in the house he had never bothered to see. The library had always been Naomi's favorite room to clean, mostly because it was the one place in the house where she could work in near total silence, undisturbed by the low hum of conversation that filled the rest of the estate. Today, that silence was what saved her. She heard the door open behind her, not the main door, but the smaller connecting door that led to Adrian's private office, a door only 4 people in the entire household had access to. She didn't turn around. Turning around was the fastest way to get noticed, and getting noticed in this house on this particular morning could be fatal. Instead, she angled herself slightly, letting the glass of a framed map on the far wall catch the reflection of the room behind her. It was a trick she'd learned years ago, in a different life, in a different city, when watching someone without watching them had meant the difference between information and a bullet. Julian Pierce moved into view in the glass, and immediately, something in Naomi's spine went rigid. His posture was wrong. Julian walked through this house like he owned a piece of it, shoulders loose, expression easy. The man reflected in the glass moved like someone who thought he was alone and running out of time. Fast, tight, checking the door behind him twice in the space of 10 seconds. He knelt beside the heavy desk near the wall panel that housed the office's private security relay, and from inside his jacket, he produced something small, dark, and precise, the kind of object that had no innocent explanation. Naomi had seen enough hardware over the years, real and improvised, to recognize the shape of intent when it was standing right in front of her. He pressed it into a seam along the base of the panel with the careful, practiced motion of someone who had done this before, or who had been shown exactly how, by someone who had. Naomi's cloth kept moving in slow, even circles against the mahogany. Her pulse did not. She understood in the space of a single breath exactly what she was looking at. A device planted inside Adrian Castellan's most trusted room could only mean one thing. Someone wanted him blind at a specific, chosen moment. Blind meant vulnerable. Vulnerable, for a man like Adrian, meant dead. And if Adrian Castellan died today, in his own house, at the hand of his own inner circle, the fragile, carefully maintained balance the hollow circle had spent 3 years building would collapse overnight. Every faction that had been quietly held in check by the unspoken threat of Castellan's stability would smell blood. The city would tear itself apart within a week, and every operation Naomi had built in the shadows would be pulled directly into the open, exposed, unprotected, hunted. Julian rose, smoothed the front of his jacket, and walked past her without a glance, his shoulder brushing hers as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to occupy the same square foot of carpet. The door clicked shut behind him. Naomi stood alone in the library, the cloth still in her hand, staring at the seam in the wall panel where something small and lethal now waited for its moment. She had 8 months of careful invisibility behind her, and a lifetime of hard-earned rules that all said the same thing. Never intervene directly, never expose yourself, never let anyone see the machinery behind the curtain. Down the hallway, she heard the familiar, unhurried rhythm of Adrian Castellan's footsteps, moving steadily toward the trap that had just been set for him. For the first time in 3 years, Naomi Bright understood that every rule she had ever built her survival around was about to be broken. She thought, absurdly, of the first rule she had ever written for the Hollow Circle, scrawled on the back of a napkin in a cramped apartment years before Ravenswood, before Adrian, before any of it. The circle survives because the circle is never seen. She had built an entire empire on that single sentence, had trained Camille and every operative beneath her to treat visibility as the one unforgivable sin. And now the sentence sat in her chest like a stone, because in the next 30 seconds she was going to break it in front of the most dangerous man in the city. She glanced once more at the seam in the wall panel, at the small dark shape she knew was hidden there, patient and lethal, waiting for its moment. Then she looked at the door, already anticipating the sound of it opening, already rehearsing, in the frantic space of a single heartbeat, exactly what she would say and how fast she would need to say it. There was no version of the next few minutes that didn't change everything. She simply had to decide which kind of change she could survive. To understand why Naomi Bright froze in that hallway, you would have needed to know what she had built before she ever put on a maid's apron. 3 years earlier, she had been someone else entirely, a name spoken only in encrypted messages, a face no rival organization had ever confirmed. The Hollow Circle had started small, a way to move information between factions who couldn't afford to trust each other directly, a neutral channel that guaranteed no one got an unfair advantage. Over time, small became essential, essential became powerful, and powerful in the hands of someone who understood restraint became something rarer still, stable. Naomi had built her network on a single principle. The city survived because no single faction could dominate the others. The moment one player grew powerful enough to eliminate the competition, the entire fragile ecosystem would collapse into open war, and open war meant attention. Police, press, federal task forces, the kind of scrutiny that destroyed everyone, winners included. Adrian Castellan's syndicate was the largest single piece on that board, not because he was the most aggressive player. He was, if anything, the most disciplined, but because his restraint had become, without his knowledge, one of the load-bearing walls of the entire structure Naomi had built. If Castellan fell, 3 smaller factions would rush to fill the vacuum simultaneously, and the resulting collision would be catastrophic. That was the official reason Naomi had spent 8 months inside his house, memorizing his routines, studying the architecture of his trust. The reason underneath that reason was harder to admit, even to herself. She had wanted to understand him, not just the syndicate, not just the numbers, him. The man who ran an empire built on violence but insisted on fresh white flowers every morning. The man whose men feared him completely and whose eyes, in unguarded moments, looked like they were carrying something heavier than any of them knew. Camille Dury, working the Hollow Circle's operations from a locked office above a laundromat, had warned her more than once that proximity was a liability. "You cannot run an empire from inside someone else's house," Camille had said during one of their rare in-person meetings. "You start caring about the furniture. Then you start caring about the man who owns it." Camille had known Naomi longer than anyone else alive, had been recruited in the network's earliest days, back when the Hollow Circle was little more than an idea scratched onto napkins and a shared conviction that the city's endless cycles of turf war were a solvable problem rather than an inevitable one. Camille had watched Naomi turn that conviction into something real, something powerful enough that entire factions unknowingly organized their strategies around a hand they never saw moving the pieces. She had also watched Naomi grow increasingly quiet over the 8 months of the Ravenswood assignment, her usual clipped, efficient updates growing longer, more detailed, occasionally drifting into observations that had nothing to do with strategic value. The way Adrian Castellan insisted on ironing his own shirts despite having staff for exactly that purpose. The particular quality of silence he carried through a room, different from the silence of every other powerful man Naomi had studied in her career. Camille had never said anything directly. She hadn't needed to. Naomi had heard the warning in every carefully neutral response Camille sent back, the deliberate absence of questions where questions would once have been natural. Naomi had dismissed the warning at the time. Standing in the library now, cloth forgotten in her hand, the seam in the wall panel burning in her peripheral vision like an open wound, she understood that Camille had been right all along. She had two choices, and only seconds to choose between them. She could do nothing. Retreat to her role, let the device do whatever it was built to do. Let Adrian Castellan walk into a trap she had watched being set. The hollow circle would survive without her personal involvement. She would simply need to move quickly afterward, to manage the fallout, to shape whichever faction rose from the wreckage before it could grow too strong. It was, by every cold calculation she had spent years perfecting, the safer option. Or she could break every rule she had ever built her survival around, step out of 8 months of careful invisibility, and warn a man who didn't know her name that someone he trusted completely was about to end his life. The footsteps in the hallway grew closer. Naomi set down the cloth. For the first time since she had built the hollow circle from nothing, the architect was about to step directly onto her own board, and there was no version of her careful, calculated mind that could predict what happened next. She thought briefly of the version of herself that had walked into Ravenswood 8 months ago, certain that she could observe Adrian Castellan from a careful, controlled distance and walk away with exactly the information she needed, nothing more. That version of Naomi had believed, with the same absolute confidence she brought to every calculation, that feelings were a variable she could simply refuse to include in the equation. That version of Naomi had been wrong, and she was running out of time to argue with the truth of it. She smoothed the front of her apron with hands that had gone unsteady for the first time in years, took one last breath meant to settle a heart that refused to be settled, and stepped out of the library into the hallway, leaving behind the last version of herself that had ever believed invisibility could last forever. The distance between the library and the private office was perhaps 40 feet of polished marble hallway. Naomi had walked it 100 times carrying trays, carrying linens, carrying the practiced silence of a woman who belonged nowhere in particular. She had never once walked it, carrying the weight she carried now. Every rule the hollow circle operated on told her to stay still. Direct intervention meant exposure. Exposure meant a face attached to a name that had spent 3 years staying deliberately faceless. If Adrian Castellan ever discovered what she truly was, not a maid, not a witness, but the architect of a network that had quietly shaped the balance of his entire criminal world, there was no version of that conversation that ended safely for her. But there was also no version of the alternative that she could live with. If she let him walk into that office and something happened to him, she would spend the rest of her life knowing she had watched it happen and said nothing, hiding behind a role she had chosen to wear like armor. Halfway there, she passed a wall of framed photographs documenting 3 generations of Castellan history. Solemn men in dark suits standing before the same gates, the same gardens, the weight of inherited power evident in every carefully composed portrait. She had studied these photographs before, in idle moments, cataloging family resemblances and the subtle shifts in the estate's architecture over the decades. She had never once imagined she would be racing past them toward a decision that could end her own carefully built existence. She reached the intersection of the 2 hallways just as Adrian came into view at the far end, moving with his usual unhurried authority, a dark, tailored figure against the pale stone. He was 30 feet from the office door. 20. Naomi's pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. She thought of Camille's warning. She thought of 3 years of careful anonymity, built one quiet transaction at a time, now standing on the edge of a cliff because of a decision she was about to make in the next 4 seconds. She stepped forward. "Mr. Castellan." Her voice cracked through the hallway's silence like something breaking. Adrian stopped, his hand already halfway to the brass door handle, and turned his head with the slow, deliberate control of a man who had learned long ago that sudden movements got people killed. His eyes found her, really found her, for what felt like the first time in 8 months. Gray, sharp, assessing. Naomi felt the full weight of that attention land on her like a physical thing, and for one disorienting moment, every careful lesson she had ever learned about staying unseen evaporated completely. Something wrong? His voice was low, controlled, giving away nothing. She had exactly one chance to get this right. If she told him plainly, in the open hallway, she risked being overheard by whoever else might be watching, and she had no way of knowing whether Julian had acted alone. If she said nothing further, the moment would pass, and he would walk through that door anyway. She closed the remaining distance between them, crossing a line that had defined her entire existence inside this house, the line between servant and something else entirely. "Your jacket, sir," she said, reaching up before he could react, her fingers finding the lapel with practiced, deliberate calm. "It's sitting wrong. May I?" It wasn't a question. She didn't wait for permission. Adrian went very still, his gray eyes narrowing slightly, searching her face for whatever this actually was. Up close, she could smell the clean, sharp scent of his cologne, could see the fine details of a face she had spent 8 months deliberately not looking at too closely. "Elena," she began internally, catching herself. No, not Elena. That was someone else's story. This was hers. This was Naomi's moment, and she had seconds left to use it. She leaned in, adjusting the lapel with slow, careful hands, and let her voice drop to something barely audible, a whisper meant for him alone. "Don't go in there," she breathed. "Julian was in your office 10 minutes ago. He planted something behind the security panel. I don't know exactly what it does, but I know it's not meant to help you." Adrian didn't move, didn't blink, but she felt the change in him instantly, the way granite feels different from stone once you understand what's buried beneath it. His hand rose, almost involuntarily, to cover hers, where it still rested against his lapel, not pulling it away, simply acknowledging the contact with a stillness that felt louder than words. For a man who projected such absolute control in every room he entered, the small gesture betrayed something Naomi hadn't expected to find in him. Uncertainty, brief and quickly suppressed, but undeniably there. "You've had 8 months to tell me something like this," he said quietly. "And you chose this morning." "I chose the morning it became true," Naomi said. "Before today, there was nothing to tell." It wasn't entirely honest, and some part of her suspected he knew that. But it was close enough to true that she could say it without her voice betraying the lie, and in the world she came from, that was often the only kind of honesty that mattered. For the first time since she'd arrived at Ravenswood, Adrian Castellan was looking at her like she was real. She could feel the seconds slipping past them, each one a small eternity in which anyone might round the corner and find them standing far closer than a Maid and her employer had any reason to stand. She thought of Vincent's suspicious eyes, of the cameras that lined every hallway of this estate, except the one room that had just become a trap, and she understood that whatever trust she was building in this fragile moment could unravel the instant a single witness misread it. Adrian's hand finally dropped from the door handle entirely. He didn't step back. If anything, he leaned fractionally closer, as though trying to read something in her face that her carefully arranged expression refused to give up. "You're not simply a woman who dusts shelves," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, the words carrying the low, testing weight of a man rebuilding an entire assumption in real time. Naomi said nothing. Silence, she had learned long ago, was often the safest answer of all. Adrian's hand remained frozen an inch from the door handle, his entire body gone still in a way Naomi had never seen from him before. Around them, the hallway held its breath. No guards, no staff, just the two of them and the low hum of the estate's climate system. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Not a demand. A test." "Julian Pierce," Naomi repeated, keeping her hands busy at his lapel, keeping her eyes down, keeping every outward signal of the moment looking exactly like what it wasn't. A maid fixing a wrinkle. "I was in the library. I saw him kneel by the wall panel near your desk. He placed something small inside the seam and left in a hurry. I don't have proof beyond what I saw with my own eyes, but I know what fear looks like, and he had it all over his face." Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're certain it was him?" "I'm certain," she said, and there was a weight in her voice that surprised even her, the flat, unshakable certainty of someone who had spent years learning to read people for a living, though she couldn't tell him that part. For a long moment, he said nothing. His gray eyes moved from her face to the office door and back again, running calculations she couldn't see. She understood, watching him, that this was a man who had survived this long, precisely because he never reacted before he had gathered every possible angle. "Why are you telling me this?" he said finally, "instead of Vincent?" It was a fair question, and a dangerous one. Naomi had already thought through the answer before she'd crossed the hallway. "Because I don't know who else Julian might have influence over, and because if I'm wrong about this, I'd rather it cost me my job than cost you your life." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that looked like recalculation. He was rebuilding in real time an entire model of the woman standing in front of him, discarding 8 months of assumptions in the space of a few seconds. "You've worked here 8 months, he said slowly. "Yes, sir." "I don't remember your face." It wasn't cruelty, it was simply true, and they both knew it. Naomi had spent every one of those 8 months making sure of exactly that. "That was rather the point," she said quietly, before she could stop herself. For the briefest instant, something almost like amusement flickered across his expression, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold, focused calculation she recognized from every account of him she'd studied before ever setting foot in this house. He stepped back from the door, releasing whatever pull it had been exerting on him, and turned his full attention to her. "If you're lying to me," he said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous, "there is nowhere in this city you could hide that I wouldn't find you." "I know," Naomi said, and meant it more than he could possibly understand. He studied her a moment longer, then reached up and adjusted his own cufflink, a small, deliberate motion that seemed to signal some internal decision reached. "Stay close," he said. "Don't go back to your usual duties, not until I understand what I'm dealing with." It was not gratitude. Men like Adrian Castellan didn't offer gratitude, but it was something, an acknowledgement, a crack in 8 months of invisibility that Naomi had never intended to create. As he turned and began walking, not toward the office, but toward the security wing where Vincent Asa kept his monitors, Naomi realized with a slow, sinking certainty that she had just done something she could never undo. She had made Adrian Castellan curious about her, and curiosity in a house like this was the most dangerous thing a secret could survive. She watched him walk away, his broad shoulders squared beneath the dark fabric of his jacket, his stride betraying nothing of the storm she suspected was building behind that controlled exterior. Somewhere down that same hallway, Julian Pierce was likely going about his morning exactly as he had for 6 years, unaware that the woman he had brushed past without a second glance had just become the single greatest threat to whatever plan he and his allies had spent months constructing. Naomi lingered a moment longer at the threshold of the office, staring at the wall panel that still concealed its secret, and felt the full, dizzying weight of what she had just set in motion. She had spent 3 years learning to move pieces from a safe distance, never touching the board directly, always trusting the careful architecture of intermediaries and encrypted channels to keep her hands clean. There was no distance left now. She had placed her own hands directly on the board, and the game had already begun to move without her permission. Vincent Asa's office smelled of stale coffee and gun oil, a windowless room lined with monitors that fed from every camera on the property, except the ones Julian Pierce had personally overseen the installation of in the private office. A detail that, once Adrian said it out loud, made the room go very quiet. "You're telling me," Vincent said slowly, arms crossed, eyes flicking toward Naomi with open suspicion, "that the maid saw something, and you're taking her word over 6 years of Julian's service." "I'm not taking anyone's word," Adrian said, his voice level. "I'm testing it." He explained the plan in short, clipped sentences, the kind of controlled efficiency that made Naomi understand exactly why this man had survived as long as he had in a business that ate most people alive within a decade. He wasn't going to confront Julian directly. A direct confrontation gave a guilty man room to lie, to stall, to warn whoever he was working with. Instead, Adrian was going to hand Julian a reason to go into that office himself and watch what happened. "There's a file," Adrian said. "Bottom drawer of my desk. Tell him I need it before the summit. Watch his face when you say it." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "And if the maid's wrong?" "Then Julian retrieves a file, and I owe her an apology for wasting the morning." Adrian's gaze slid briefly to Naomi, unreadable. "And if she's right, we learn exactly how deep this goes." Naomi stood at the edge of the room, arms folded tightly against the sudden cold that had settled into her chest. She had expected many outcomes when she crossed that hallway: exposure, dismissal, disbelief. She had not expected to be standing in a room watching a man she'd spent months quietly studying construct a trap with the same cold precision she used in her own work 3 miles away, in a locked room Adrian didn't know existed. It was unsettling how easily she recognized the shape of his thinking. It was more unsettling how much she respected it. "What happens to him?" she asked quietly. "If he's guilty?" Adrian's expression didn't change. "What happens to anyone who tries to kill me?" Vincent, halfway to the door, paused and looked back at Naomi with renewed suspicion, as though her question itself was evidence of something he hadn't yet identified. "You're awfully concerned about a man's welfare," he said, "for someone who just accused him of treason." "I'm not concerned about Julian," Naomi said evenly. "I'm concerned about precedent. If you're wrong about this, or if this becomes public before it should, it changes how every other person in this house behaves toward each other. Fear makes people sloppy. Sloppy people make mistakes that get other people killed." It was, she realized only after the words had left her mouth, exactly the kind of calculation she would have made in her old life, phrased in language that belonged to strategy rooms and encrypted briefings rather than staff quarters. Vincent's eyes narrowed further, cataloging the discrepancy even if he couldn't yet name it. Adrian, however, seemed to weigh her words seriously, nodding once as though the observation had merit worth considering. "She's not wrong," he told Vincent. "Whatever happens to Julian happens quietly, and it happens after we understand exactly how deep this runs. I want names, not headlines." Vincent left without further argument, though his glance lingered on Naomi a moment longer than necessary before he disappeared down the hallway. The finality in his voice should have frightened her. In her old life, in the careful architecture of the hollow circle, violence was a tool she used sparingly and only when every other option had failed. She had built her network specifically to prevent moments like this one, moments where a single decision could ripple outward into something no one could contain. But watching Adrian Castellan calculate his next move with total, unhurried control, she found herself thinking not about the violence to come, but about the strange, unfamiliar pull she felt toward the man responsible for it. Vincent left the room to summon Julian, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Adrian remained by the bank of monitors, watching a feed of the empty office with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "You never answered my question," he said without turning. "Who are you, really?" Naomi's pulse spiked. "I told you, I'm your housekeeper." "You told me a job title," he said. "That's not the same thing." Before she could construct an answer that wasn't a lie, but wasn't the truth either, the monitor flickered to life, showing Julian Pierce walking stiffly into the office, his face already pale, his hand trembling as it hovered over the leather chair behind the desk. Whatever conversation Adrian had wanted to continue would have to wait. The trap was closing, and Naomi realized, with a cold jolt, that she had no idea whether she was about to witness justice or the first crack in a wall that was about to bring her entire hidden life crashing down with it. She glanced sideways at Adrian, studying the rigid line of his jaw, the way his knuckles had whitened almost imperceptibly against the edge of the desk he leaned on. For a man who had built his entire reputation on unshakable calm, the tension radiating off him now was unmistakable, buried deep but unmistakable, and Naomi found herself wondering, in the strange, suspended quiet of that room, whether the calculation currently running behind his eyes had any room left in it for her at all, or whether, once Julian's fate was decided, his focus would simply turn, cold and absolute, back to the question of who she truly was. On the monitor, Julian reached the desk. His hand trembled visibly now, betraying every carefully rehearsed year of composure he had built inside this house. Naomi realized she was holding her breath again, this time not for Adrian's sake alone, but for the fragile, uncertain thing that had begun to grow between them in the space of a single terrifying morning. On the monitor, Julian Pierce stood beside the massive desk, like a man standing at the edge of a grave, his eyes darting toward the wall panel where he had hidden the device only an hour before. Adrian watched in silence, his arms crossed, his expression a mask of perfect, terrible calm. "Sit," came Adrian's voice from a small speaker built into the desk itself, a feature Naomi hadn't known existed until this exact moment. "Find the file." Julian's hand hovered over the leather chair, hesitation written across every line of his body. "Sir, I really think we should head to the summit first. We're already—" "Sit down, Julian." The command carried no room for argument. On the screen, Julian's shoulders sagged with the particular defeat of a man who understood, in that instant, that he had no good options left. He lowered himself into the chair. Naomi held her breath. Nothing happened. For one suspended second, the room seemed to exhale collectively. And then Adrian, watching the feed with narrowed eyes, said quietly, "It's not a trigger tied to weight. It's tied to something else. Vincent, get eyes on the panel now." By the time they reached the office, Julian had located the false file exactly where Adrian had claimed it would be, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the folder. Adrian entered first, Naomi close behind him, despite every instinct telling her to stay in the shadows where she belonged. Adrian crossed to the desk without a word, reached down, and ripped the side panel away with a violent crack of splintering wood. Nestled in the dark seam, exactly where Naomi had seen it placed, sat the small device. Not a bomb, she realized now, seeing it up close for the first time, but something more insidious. A signal relay designed to override the office's private security feed and broadcast Adrian's most sensitive conversations directly to an outside receiver. Not a weapon meant to kill him quickly, a weapon meant to expose every secret he had to whoever was waiting on the other end. "Marcus Feld," Adrian said quietly, turning the device over in his hand, reading a serial number Naomi couldn't see, but that clearly meant something to him. "This is his signature work." Julian's face had gone the color of ash. "Adrian, I can explain—" "You can't," Adrian said, and something in his voice made even Naomi's skin go cold. "You've been feeding Feld information for months. This was never about killing me today. It was about handing him everything I know, piece by piece, until he didn't need to kill me at all. He'd already owned everything that mattered." Julian's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words coming out that could undo what had already been proven. 6 years, Adrian said, his voice dropping lower, quieter, somehow more dangerous for its lack of volume. "I brought you into rooms I've never let anyone else into. I told you things about this operation that could end me if they ever reached the wrong ears. And you sold every one of those rooms to Marcus Feld for whatever he offered you." "It wasn't like that," Julian said, his voice cracking. "He came to me 8 months ago. He had things, information about my brother, about debts I couldn't pay any other way. I didn't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," Adrian said. "You made yours the moment you decided my life was a fair price for your problems." He straightened, some of the coiled tension in his shoulders settling into something colder, more final. "I would have helped you. If you'd come to me instead of him, I would have solved whatever problem you were carrying without a second thought. That's what 6 years should have taught you about how I treat the people I trust." Julian's face crumpled, the last of his composure finally giving way entirely, but Adrian had already turned from him. The conversation, and whatever remained of 6 years of loyalty, closed. Adrian crushed the device in his fist, the sound of breaking circuitry sharp in the sudden silence. He turned to Vincent. "Take him. We'll discuss his future somewhere less comfortable." As the guards led Julian away, his composure finally shattering into something raw and desperate, Adrian remained standing behind the ruined panel, staring at the wreckage of 6 years of trust. Then, slowly, his gray eyes lifted and found Naomi standing at the threshold of the office, the same threshold she had watched Julian cross with his lie only hours before. "You knew what that device did," he said. It wasn't a question. Naomi's mind raced. She hadn't known the specifics, a relay, Feld's signature, but she had recognized the shape of the danger the moment she saw it planted, the same way she recognized every dangerous shape in her old life, the one that had nothing to do with dusting shelves. "I knew enough," she said carefully. Adrian studied her for a long, unreadable moment, the wreckage of the panel between them, the name Marcus Feld hanging in the air like smoke. "That's twice today," he said quietly, "that you've known more than you should." Naomi held his gaze and said nothing, aware that any explanation she offered now would only raise more questions than it answered. Behind them, through the office's outer window, she could hear the faint commotion of guards escorting Julian toward the estate's lower levels, his protests growing fainter with distance, swallowed eventually by the thick stone walls that had kept so many secrets over the years. Adrian set the crushed remains of the device on the desk between them, a small, broken thing that had nearly cost him everything, and studied it in silence for a long moment before looking back up at her. "Marcus Feld doesn't send amateurs," he said. "If Julian was the first crack, there will be others. People I've trusted for years, people I'd never think to suspect." His gray eyes settled on her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thinner. "And somehow, the one person in this house I never thought to watch closely turned out to be the only one paying proper attention." "That should tell you something," Naomi said quietly. "It does," Adrian said. "It tells me I have a great deal to learn about the woman standing in my office." The office fell silent after the guards led Julian away, the air still faintly sharp with the smell of broken circuitry. Adrian stood behind the ruined desk panel for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the space where trust had lived for 6 years before it hadn't. Then he turned, fully, to Naomi. "You have a name," he said. It wasn't the question it should have been. It was closer to an acknowledgement, the recognition of something he had missed for far too long. "Naomi," she said. It was the truth, at least the truth she had built for herself, and in this moment, standing in the wreckage of a plot she had personally unraveled, it felt strange to hear her own name spoken aloud by him, like it belonged to someone new. "Naomi," Adrian repeated slowly, testing the shape of it. 8 months in this house, and I never once asked. You had no reason to. I have several reasons now." He crossed the room toward her, his movements unhurried, deliberate, the same controlled energy she'd watched him carry through every hallway of this house without ever really seeing it directed at her. He stopped a careful distance away, close enough that she could read the shift in his expression, far enough that it still felt like a question rather than a demand. There was, before he closed that distance, a brief pause in which his gaze drifted toward the window, toward the gardens he crossed every morning without truly seeing. 6 years I trusted Julian, because he never gave me reason not to," he said quietly. 8 months I overlooked you, because I never had reason to look. I'm beginning to think both of those failures came from the same blind spot. "They weren't the same failure," Naomi said. "Julian betrayed a trust you gave him freely. I never asked for your trust at all. I only asked to be overlooked, and now you can't be." "No," she said. "Now I can't be." A maid doesn't recognize a signal relay. he said quietly. A maid doesn't know Marcus Feld's name well enough to connect it to a piece of hardware the size of a coin. A maid doesn't stop a man like Julian Pierce from setting a trap that even Vincent's security sweeps missed for a full week. Naomi felt the ground shifting beneath the careful architecture of her disguise, piece by piece, faster than she could shore it back up. "I've had an unusual life," she said, which was true, and told him almost nothing. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you right now." Something flickered across his face. Not anger, which she had braced for, but something closer to curiosity, sharp and focused, the same expression she imagined he wore when studying a rival's territory for weaknesses. She understood, with a sinking certainty, that she had just become a puzzle to a man who solved puzzles for a living. "You saved my life today," he said. "I don't forget debts like that. But I also don't leave questions like this unanswered, Naomi. Not in my own house." "I understand." "Do you?" He studied her a moment longer, then stepped back, some internal decision settling into place behind his eyes. "You're not returning to your regular duties, not yet. Vincent will find you quarters closer to the main house. Until I understand exactly who I let clean my home for 8 months, you'll stay where I can see you." It was not an arrest. It was not quite trust either. It was something new and uncertain, a space neither of them had a name for yet. As Adrian turned to address the mess Julian had left behind, calling for a cleanup crew and a secure line to reach out to his other lieutenants, Naomi stood very still, feeling the last of her careful invisibility dissolve completely. She had built the hollow circle on the principle that no one could touch what they couldn't see. For 3 years, that principle had kept her safe, kept her network safe, kept an entire fragile ecosystem of power in careful, controlled balance. Now the most dangerous man in the city knew her name, suspected there was more beneath the surface, and had just placed her exactly where he could watch her every move. Somewhere across the city, in a locked office above a laundromat, Camille Dury was about to receive a message that would tell her Naomi's cover inside Ravenswood had just been compromised, and neither of them yet understood how much worse it was about to get. Vincent Ossa arrived 20 minutes later to escort Naomi to her new quarters, his expression carrying none of the easy dismissal he had shown her for 8 months. Instead, he studied her the way he studied every potential threat that crossed his path, cataloging details, filing them away for later use. "Castellan doesn't relocate staff without a reason," he said as they walked. "Whatever you did in that office, you've earned yourself a much closer set of eyes." "I'm aware," Naomi said. "Mine, specifically," Vincent added, in case that wasn't clear. She didn't doubt it. She had built her entire career reading the exact kind of suspicion Vincent wore openly on his face, and she understood that from this moment forward, every action she took inside Ravenswood would be measured, weighed, and reported. The comfortable anonymity that had let her move freely through this house for 8 months was gone, replaced by something far more precarious: visibility and the constant, exhausting work of managing what people saw when they finally looked at her directly. The message reached Camille just after noon, 3 words typed into an encrypted channel that had gone silent for 8 months. "Cover is thinning." Camille Dury read it twice, then set down her coffee with the particular stillness of someone recalculating every plan they'd built around a single, load-bearing assumption. Naomi Bright never sent vague warnings. If she said thinning, she meant it had already begun to tear. What Camille didn't know, what Naomi hadn't had time to explain in 3 words typed under the watchful new arrangement of her days at Ravenswood, was that the name Marcus Feld had just surfaced inside Adrian Castellan's private office, attached to a device meant to hollow out his entire operation from within. Camille knew that name. The hollow circle had been tracking Feld's ambitions for over a year, watching him slowly, patiently position pieces around the edges of the city's balance, always careful never to move too fast, never to draw attention. He had approached 2 of the smaller factions already, with offers of partnership that were, upon closer inspection, offers of absorption. The hollow circle had quietly discouraged both, using channels so indirect that Feld likely never knew his plans had been interfered with at all. If Feld had turned his ambitions toward Castellan directly, toward the single largest, most stable piece on the board, then the fragile ecosystem Naomi had spent 3 years protecting was no longer facing a distant threat. It was facing an active one, moving fast and moving through the one house Naomi could no longer freely leave. Camille began pulling threads immediately, working through the network's channels with the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Within 2 hours, she had confirmation from 3 separate sources. Marcus Feld had spent the last 6 months quietly acquiring debts, favors, and loyalties among several of Castellan's mid-level operators, laying groundwork for exactly the kind of internal collapse that Julian Pierce's device had been the final piece of. She pulled up the network's old surveillance files on Feld, tracing his rise through the city's underworld over the past 3 years. He had started small, absorbing 2 minor operations on the docks that no one had bothered to protect, then expanded methodically into territory the Hollow Circle had always considered too fragmented to matter. It was only in the last year that his ambitions had grown teeth, his acquisitions shifting from opportunistic to deliberate, each move calculated to weaken a specific rival before the next one began. Castellan had always been the obvious final target, too large to absorb through simple force, too well defended to challenge directly. Feld's solution, Camille now understood, had never been to defeat the syndicate from outside. It had been to hollow it out from within, one loyal man at a time, until the empire collapsed under the weight of its own compromised foundations. It wasn't one traitor. It was an entire slow, patient siege, and Julian had simply been the first domino positioned to fall. Camille sent a second message, this one longer, carrying everything she'd found in those 2 frantic hours. She ended it with a question she already suspected she knew the answer to. "Do you need extraction?" The reply took almost an hour to arrive, longer than any silence Naomi had ever left her second-in-command sitting with before. "No. I need to finish what I started." Camille stared at the message for a long time before she understood what it actually meant. Naomi wasn't just protecting her cover anymore. She was choosing, deliberately, to stay inside a house where the most dangerous man in the city had just begun watching her every move. Because leaving now would mean abandoning Adrian Castellan to a siege he didn't yet fully understand, and abandoning the entire fragile balance the Hollow Circle had built its existence around. It was, by every rule the network operated on, an unacceptable risk. It was also, Camille realized with a slow, uneasy certainty, exactly the kind of decision Naomi would have criticized in anyone else. The decision of someone whose judgment had become entangled with feelings she hadn't accounted for. Still, Camille understood the deeper logic, even as she worried over its cost. Pulling Naomi out now would leave Ravenswood without the one set of eyes capable of tracking Feld's next move from the inside, and it would leave Adrian Castellan blind at the exact moment his enemies were most emboldened. The Hollow Circle had never operated on sentiment, but it had always operated on the understanding that some risks, however uncomfortable, were smaller than the alternative. She spent the rest of the afternoon rerouting resources, quietly repositioning 2 of the network's most reliable operatives closer to the districts Feld had been courting, laying the groundwork for whatever countermeasures Naomi might need in the days ahead. It was careful, unglamorous work, the kind that never appeared in the stories people told about criminal empires rising and falling, but it was exactly the kind of work that had kept the city's fragile peace intact for 3 years running. By evening, Camille had assembled enough intelligence to fill a small folder. Troop movements disguised as shipping routes, encrypted meetings disguised as social calls, the slow, patient architecture of a siege built to look like nothing at all until it was already too late to stop. She packaged it into a single encrypted file and sent it to Naomi with a short note. "Everything you'll need. Be careful. You're not just protecting the city anymore." She didn't specify what else there was to protect. She suspected, watching the message send, that Naomi already knew exactly what she meant. Back at Ravenswood, in a guest suite far closer to the main house than her old staff quarters had ever been, Naomi sat with her burner terminal open on her lap, the cursor blinking beneath Camille's unanswered question, and felt the full weight of the choice she had just made settle over her. She had spent 3 years building an empire designed to never need a face. Now her face was the only thing standing between Adrian Castellan and a war that would burn the entire city to the ground. And she had no idea how much longer she could keep both halves of herself separate before one collapsed into the other. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Adrian's footsteps stop outside her door. She closed the terminal slowly, sliding it beneath a folded blanket on the bed, and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of standing at the exact intersection of 2 lives that had never been meant to touch. On one side stood 3 years of careful, bloodless architecture, a network built to protect a city that would never know her name. On the other stood a single locked door, and a man on the other side of it who had just begun to ask questions. She had spent her entire adult life making sure no one would ever think to ask. She thought of every warning Camille had ever given her about proximity, about the particular danger of caring for the people you were meant to only observe. She thought of the fresh white flowers Adrian ordered every morning without explanation, of the loneliness she had glimpsed behind his controlled exterior on mornings when he thought no one was watching. The footsteps outside her door did not move away. Naomi crossed the small room, her heart hammering with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear of exposure and everything to do with the terrifying, unfamiliar possibility of being known. Adrian didn't knock. He simply stood in the doorway when Naomi opened it, his gray eyes moving briefly past her to the burner terminal still open on the bed before returning to her face with an expression that told her he had already seen more than she wanted him to. "That's not a phone the staffing agency issued you," he said quietly. Naomi's hand hovered near the terminal, calculating for one final desperate second whether there was still a version of this conversation where she could talk her way back into invisibility. There wasn't. She understood that the moment she met his eyes. "No," she said. "It isn't." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, an act that in this house carried the weight of a decision, a choice to hear whatever came next without an audience, without guards, without the armor of his usual authority standing between them. "I had Vincent run a deeper check after this morning," he said. "Your background checks out on paper. Every reference, every previous employer. It's flawless. Too flawless for someone whose only ambition was cleaning silver." He studied her, unhurried, the same careful attention he brought to every threat he'd ever dismantled. "I want the truth, Naomi, whatever it costs." She thought of Camille's unanswered question. She thought of 3 years spent building something that had never needed a face, and of the one man in the city whose survival had somehow, without her permission, become tangled up with feelings she'd spent her whole life training herself not to have. "My name is Naomi Bright," she said slowly. "That part was always true. What I do, what I've built, has a different name. People call it the Hollow Circle, when they know to call it anything at all. I built it to keep factions like yours from tearing this city apart, fighting each other. For 3 years, it's worked, mostly because no one has ever known who's holding the strings." Adrian went very still, the pieces visibly assembling behind his eyes. The fresh flowers he'd never questioned, the 8 months of quiet efficiency, the impossible knowledge of a device most professionals wouldn't have recognized on sight. "You've been running this city," he said, "from inside my house." "I've been protecting this city," she corrected, "and you happen to be the largest piece I couldn't afford to lose. Marcus Feld has spent 6 months building toward exactly what happened this morning. Julian was the first crack. He won't be the last." For a long moment, Adrian said nothing, his expression unreadable in a way that made her chest tighten with something dangerously close to fear. Not of what he might do, but of what he might decide, about who she truly was. "You could have let me die," he said finally. "It would have simplified things for whatever you're building." "It would have destroyed everything I built," she said honestly. "But that's not why I warned you." "Then why?" She held his gaze, choosing, for the first time in 3 years, to answer with something that had nothing to do with strategy. "Because somewhere in the last 8 months, you stopped being a piece on my board. I don't entirely know when that happened. I only know it did." Something shifted in Adrian's face. Not softness, exactly. That wasn't a word that fit a man built the way he was, but a kind of recognition. The particular stillness of someone realizing the ground beneath him had quietly become something new. "Feld will come again," he said. "Harder next time, now that his first move has failed." "I know," Naomi said. "And when he does, he'll be facing both of us, not a maid and not a shadow. Whatever we decide to be instead." Adrian studied her for a long moment, the gray in his eyes softening into something that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, almost like partnership. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, "we'd better decide quickly." Outside the window, the city stretched out in its usual restless silence, unaware that the fragile balance holding it together had just gained its first true ally, a queen who had spent 3 years ruling from the shadows and had finally chosen, for one man's sake, to be seen. Adrian moved to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens he had spent so many mornings staring through without ever truly seeing, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed shape, Naomi realized. It no longer felt like the careful, guarded silence of a servant and her employer, each keeping their true selves locked behind practiced expressions. It felt, instead, like the silence of two people who had just discovered how much weight the other one had been carrying alone. "Feld will hear about Julian by tonight," Adrian said finally. "He'll assume his first move failed cleanly, without knowing why. That buys us time, but not much of it." "Then we use what we have," Naomi said, moving to stand beside him, close enough now that the distance between maid and master had become something else entirely, something neither title could fully describe anymore. "The Hollow Circle has eyes in 3 of the factions Feld has been courting. If he moves again, we'll know before his own lieutenants do." Adrian glanced at her, something unfamiliar softening the hard line of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Naomi felt it land somewhere beneath her ribs. 3 years building an empire no one was supposed to see," he said. "And the first crack in it happened because you couldn't watch me walk into a trap." "I've made peace with worse mistakes," Naomi said. "Was it a mistake?" She considered the question honestly, weighing 3 years of careful architecture against the strange, unplanned warmth that had settled into her chest since the moment she crossed that hallway. "No," she admitted. "It was the first honest thing I've done since I came to this house." Adrian studied her a moment longer, then extended his hand. Not the gesture of an employer to a servant, but something closer to an equal offering a partnership neither of them had expected to need. "Then let's make sure it was worth it," he said. "Both of us, this time. No more shadows." Naomi looked at his hand, then at the city beyond the window, vast and unaware of how close it had come to unraveling that morning, and understood that whatever came next, Feld's retaliation, the slow unraveling of the Hollow Circle's careful anonymity, the impossible balancing act of running an empire from inside another empire's walls, she would not be facing it alone anymore. She took his hand. Somewhere across the city, Marcus Feld was already planning his next move, unaware that the woman he had never known existed was about to become the single greatest obstacle standing between him and everything he wanted. The board had changed. The Queen had finally stepped into the light, and she had no intention of ever disappearing again. If you enjoyed this Mafia story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more thrilling stories. And before you go, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to see where our viewers are from around the world.